Hello, James Alexander, psychologist here. Today I'm wanting to take you through the basic EFT process. EFT stands for Emotional Freedom Techniques. People may very well have heard of this before. It involves tapping on genuine acupuncture points while you're reciting a phrase about the thing that you're wanting to change, the emotional aspect of your experience or what's going on in your life. So I'm going to run you through the basic procedure. Again, as with my EMDR videos, this is primarily for my own clients, so as to save time when I'm seeing you in person. You can just watch this rather than use up the time in the consult. So, EFT, Emotional Freedom Techniques, is sometimes called an energy psychology approach. And there seems to be a couple of different ways of making sense of why this works. Why could it possibly be that tapping on particular parts of your body while you're repeating a phrase has any positive impact at all? And there's basically two explanations that I've been able to come across. One is an explanation from traditional Chinese medicine, the idea that you're tapping on genuine acupuncture points while you're doing this process, in which case it's called acupressure as opposed to acupuncture. And the notion is, of course, that we have flow lines of energy running through our body called meridians. We have life force called the chi or the ki energy, which runs through these meridians. And the problem being that the meridians can become blocked as a result of illness or injury or psychological experiences. And acupressure or acupuncture, according to traditional Chinese medicine, is able to unblock the meridians to allow the chi or the ki energy to sort of flow through naturally, which therefore resolves the problem. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not trained in traditional Chinese medicine, and as a result, it's not the explanatory system that I use to make sense of why EFT works. The way I make sense of it is simply it's a different language, and there are different languages or different ways of making sense of why things happen in reality. And the language that I use to make sense of why EFT works is simply not the one derived from traditional Chinese medicine. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just a different language. The language that I'm trained in, being a Westerner, is more, and being a Westerner trained in scientific approaches, it's more of a scientific, more of a psychological / neurological way of making sense of something like EFT. Again, I'm not saying it's right, it's just simply the language and the meaning system that makes more sense to me. People can make whatever sense they like of EFT and go with whatever explanation makes more sense to them. I'm going to introduce to you today the way of making sense of EFT that works for me. Okay, so the process itself involves tapping on specific points that are genuine acupuncture points. As I said before, because we're tapping, they're referred to as acupressure as opposed to acupuncture. But they're all very real acupuncture points from traditional Chinese medicine. One thing I will say about traditional Chinese medicine and the notion of meridians is that there's a range of phenomenon that acupuncture has been demonstrated to be effective for. And this finding holds true when they're comparing genuine acupuncture points in research compared to what they call sham acupuncture points, so fake ones. And for some reason they find that the genuine acupuncture, for the things that acupuncture works for, and that's not everything, but it is a fairly broad range of phenomenon, for the things that acupuncture works for, the genuine acupuncture points seem to be superior to the sham acupuncture points. I've also read in the literature that there's in our body and in the muscles there are channels in the myofascial tissue, and apparently there's about an 80% correspondence between the channels in the myofascial tissue which surrounds our muscles and the meridians. So it's not 100%, And you might often hear people say, but there's nothing in Western science has been able to confirm this idea of meridians or flow lines of energy, whereas in fact there's about an 80% correlation between the channels in the myofascial tissue and traditional Chinese notion of meridians. So there does seem to be some kind of physical structure that appears to be involved. Okay, so EFT, emotional freedom techniques, goes back to a psychologist by the surname of Callahan. It was either the 60s or the 70s, and he was working with a woman who had an extreme water phobia. He had recently done some training with somebody who was actually a chiropractor around using acupressure, and he'd been treating this woman for the water phobia unsuccessfully with all the things that psychology at the time had to offer. And he decided to get her to start tapping on various spots around her body while she was sitting next to a pool. After a few minutes of doing that, she was laughing in a delighted way. She was splashing water on her face from the pool, as opposed to being terrified of the water. So from that, he developed what he called thought field therapy, and it may have been sometime in the 80s or the 90s, somebody else got hold of thought field therapy, sort of fine-tuned the process and arrived at emotional freedom techniques, or EFT. And the process itself continues to go through kinds of evolutions. I first came across it possibly around 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. And I've been using the process that I came across that time ever since, because I've found it to be effective. My understanding is that there are elements of the process that I use that the people that now are promoting EFT no longer have those elements in the process that they're promoting. That's okay. There's nothing inconsistent about it. I think that they've reduced the process a little bit because they figured that there were elements of that process that weren't necessary. I've simply hung on to all the elements that I first came across with the EFT process 20-25 years ago, thereabouts. The process itself, when you get the hang of it, takes about a minute and a half to do. And the idea is that you may very well repeat that over and over again quite a few times. It's more time consuming when you're learning how to do it, but once you've learned how to do it, that tends to take, 4 or 5 goes of doing the process to learn it. Then it's quite possible to whip through it reasonably quickly. Okay, how to make sense of why EFT works from a neuropsychological perspective. And I must add also, I'm not a neuropsychologist. I'm a psychologist that has an interest, as do I gather all psychologists these days, have a great deal of interest in neurology, simply because of the better imaging techniques that have become available, like functional MRIs, etc., over the last 15 years, which has revealed a lot more of what's going on in the brain. So although I'm not a neuropsychologist, I've read fairly extensively in neuropsychology and neurology and neuroscience in general. So this is the sense that I've made of as to why EFT works. The process begins with formulating and repeating a verbal phrase about the thing that you're wanting to change. And the standard approach, what they call the setup phrase, is as follows. It says, even though I have this, fill in the blank with whatever it is that you're wanting to address, I deeply and completely accept myself. So let's say if you're feeling highly anxious about having to sit an exam tomorrow, you might say, even though I feel highly anxious about my exam tomorrow, I deeply and completely accept myself. While you're stating that, and the idea is that you repeat that 3 times, you're tapping on what they call the karate chop point. So if you imagine giving somebody a karate chop, it's that part of your hand that would come in contact with them. I tend to use 3 fingers just to make sure that I'm actually covering all the possible spots in that place. So you're repeating the phrase, even though I'm feeling anxious about my exam tomorrow, I deeply and completely accept myself. And repeat that 3 times whilst you're continuously tapping on the karate chop point. Now, what that's about is it is referring to something which is real for you. So if you really do have an exam tomorrow, you really are highly anxious about it, that's a very real phenomenon that's going on with you emotionally, and it's also going on within you neurologically. So within our brain, we can think of the brain as being constituted of the brainstem, which is basically sits on top of the spinal column, and it's the brain matter involved in maintaining the biological functions that are necessary for life. On top of the brainstem, there's an area of brain called the limbic system, sometimes called the mammalian brain, because we share this with mammals. And it's the limbic system or the mammalian brain which allows us to experience emotions. So it adds an emotional flavour to our experience. On top of the limbic system is an additional layer of brain matter called the cerebral cortex, which is Latin for the outer bark. And this is the outer bark of the brain. So when you see images of a brain and you see all that sort of squiggly kind of matte brain matter, what you're looking at is the outer bark of the cerebral cortex. And there's a whole range of different functions of the cerebral cortex. That's sometimes called the human brain, because while other animals have got it, humans seem to have that to a greater degree than most other animals. Now, within the limbic system, that middle area, is a small brain module called the amygdala, which is about the size and shape of an almond. And as with most things in the brain, we have 2 of them. We have one in each hemisphere, because the brain is basically divided into 2 hemispheres with adjoining brain matter down the middle, which brings them together. So the right hemisphere, the amygdala in the right hemisphere, is essentially our distress centre. It's not the only part of the brain that does distress, but it tends to be the part of the brain that's most active when we're experiencing fear, anxiety or anger. There are other brain areas that are also involved in emotion, including distressed emotion, but the amygdala in the right hemisphere seems to be the place where the most activity is going on when we're in a highly distressed state, be it anxiety, panic, fear, anger, etc. Now, when we're doing the setup phrase, repeating the setup phrase, essentially what we're doing is we're turning on the activity in our amygdala. So if we're referring to something that's real to us, like the fear of the exam tomorrow, then it's turning on the amygdala in the right hemisphere with a whole lot of electrochemical activity. I often give the example to people, if you've nearly choked on a sandwich before and you had to be rushed to hospital in an emergency tracheotomy and they cut your throat open in order to free up the airwaves, and it's a highly traumatic experience, you managed to survive it, but you're left with a great deal of trauma about the whole experience. Any casual mention of a ham sandwich or any kind of sandwich that you hear is likely to ignite this activity in your amygdala. A whole lot of electrochemical activity is likely to become activated in your right hemisphere amygdala, and you're likely to go into a panic state, a highly anxious or distressed or fearful state, because the fear derived from that traumatic experience of nearly dying because of a sandwich getting stuck in your throat has basically been encoded, that experience has been encoded in your amygdala and is easily triggered when you hear any mention or you think of a sandwich. Okay, so there's a whole lot of electrochemical activity gets generated. So I've just got a diagram which I'm going to draw here to help to explain this. And you can see from this picture, basically that's my depiction of the amygdala. And when somebody's in a highly stressed, anxious, panicky, fearful or angry state, that brain module, the amygdala, becomes highly activated. So I'm just going to draw swirls around that, which just kind of demonstrate there's a whole lot of activity going on there. Now, essentially, from a neurological perspective, you can think of a brain cell as being like a microscopic jellyfish. It doesn't actually look anything like my hand, so this is just a very rough model, but imagine that's the body of the brain cell, and imagine this is in microscopic scale, and off the body of the brain cell are basically tentacles which then communicate with other brain cells, or allow communication with other brain cells. And every brain cell has 7 to 10,000 of these tentacles or potential connections with other brain cells, and they then communicate with other ones, etc. And so every experience that we have, every thought we have, everything that we do, every emotion we feel is encoded in brain activity in patterns of connections between these brain cells. And the most simplest activities like brushing your teeth or tying your shoelaces would involve millions and millions and millions of these brain cells and millions of connections between the brain cells. So brain activity is involved in everything that we experience and everything that we do, including fear of the exam tomorrow or fear of sandwiches. And when we're talking about fear, it's the amygdala that's the most active part of our brain. Okay, so when we're repeating a verbal phrase about the thing that we're wanting to change, then because that reflects an actual experience, let's say fear of the exam or trauma from nearly choking to death on a sandwich, then the amygdala becomes highly activated. So the setup phrase, when we're saying, even though I'm feeling very anxious about my exam tomorrow, the verbal phrase is referring to something real, and that's going to incite activity, electrochemical activity in the amygdala. And so all of a sudden the neural pathways relating to that fear of the exam or the fear of the sandwich, etc., becomes highly activated, and electrochemical activity begins to whiz around those neural pathways involving millions of brain cells, and it becomes more and more intense every time it just sort of whizzes around, and it becomes more deeply entrenched. So it becomes very available to us to feel that fear the more deeply entrenched that neural pathway becomes. When we're repeating the verbal phrase, even though I feel anxious about my exam tomorrow, we're turning that on. Now, as with EMDR, the distress needs to be activated on a neurological level. It needs to be turned on in order for it to be able to move. Some people will say, well, this sounds like I'm repeating some kind of affirmation about the thing that I'm wanting to get rid of. I'm wanting to get rid of the anxiety about the exam, and this is repeating a phrase about the anxiety about the exam, and isn't that further entrenching the anxiety about the exam? So as with EMDR, if we don't turn this stuff on, it's not going anywhere. And that's one of the basic cornerstones of transformative psychotherapies, that this stuff needs to be activated in order to be able to move. So repeating the verbal phrase while we're tapping on the karate chop point is hitting the on button. It's turning it on so that this energy will be able to move. Now, I often use the example as a metaphor or as a model of this phenomenon with a novelty lamp that became popular, I think, in the 1980s, called a plasma ball. You may or may not remember them, but it's a glass dome that has an electrical element in the middle of it, from which are shooting out a whole bunch of these colourful lightning bolts out to the surfaces of the dome. And here it is. This is a plasma ball. So you can see there's the electrical core in the middle of it, and as a result there are gases contained within the dome, and there's electrical currents, and it's shooting out these colourful kind of lightning bolts all over the dome. And let's use this as a model for the brain. It's a very simplistic and crude model, obviously. The brain is a lot more complex than this, and it looks nothing like that at all, and doesn't function anything like that, but let's just use it as an explanatory model. And let's say the electrical core that's shooting out all this electrical activity is, in this model, analogous to your amygdala. And you can see there's a whole lot of electrical activity going on there. Let's say if the electrical core is like the amygdala, let's call it the amygdala. It's highly activated. There's electrochemical activity going on. It's shooting out all these bolts, these lightning bolts, in the way that the amygdala, when it becomes highly activated, it's turned on. It's shooting out electrochemical activity to neighbouring neurons, and it creates that neural pathway. And there's a whole lot of electrical activity going on. Now, if this is the amygdala, that electrical core, the goal is basically to turn off that amount of activity so that we settle down the amygdala, and you end up not feeling highly anxious. You end up feeling calm. Okay? Now, in order to do that, let's imagine that this plasma ball is battery operated. And because it's battery operated, it's got a finite power source. And what we want to do is we want to basically flatten the battery of the amygdala so that it's no longer shooting out all these lightning bolts, which is basically we feel as anxiety. So in order to flatten the battery, firstly what we have to do is turn it on. We're not going to flatten the battery unless it's on. So we turn it on, the amygdala becomes highly activated, it's shooting out all this electrical activity out to the neighbouring neurons. How are we going to flatten the battery? Okay, well, the thing about plasma balls is if I put my hand on it, it creates an electrical pole. And you can see that rather than being a whole bunch of those random lightning bolts, it's created an electrical pole, and it's sending the one form of light out to wherever I put my hand. Wherever I put my finger, it's going to send it out to that spot. Okay, you can see that. Creates an electrical pole. Alright, we'll come back to that in a moment. So, what we've done with the setup phrase is we've turned on the amygdala, and it needs to be on so that we can flatten the battery. Okay, now once we've done the setup phrase, we then start tapping on all the different acupuncture points which I'm going to run you through. And all this is available on a sheet of paper which I can give you if you're my client. If you're not my client, then it should be available from the EFT Universe website, which is absolutely loaded with information about EFT. Well worth having a good look at that and reading lots of the articles, and there's probably a lot of videos on there by now as well. Okay, so I'm going to show you all the different spots to tap. The very first spot is the beginning of the eyebrow, just where the fur starts. Now I'm right-handed, so I'm using my right hand, and I'm going to the left side of my body. And I'm going to use 2 fingers to tap so as to ensure that I'm covering a bigger surface area. If there is this 80% correlation between channels in the connective tissue and specific acupuncture points, I want to make sure I'm actually covering that possibility. So I'm tapping with 2 fingers to cover a greater surface area, which increases my chances of hitting the right spot. And you're going to tap about 8 times on each of these spots that I show you. And the important thing is that while you're doing that, you're repeating a phrase about the thing that you're wanting to change. So the setup phrase said, even though I'm feeling anxious about my exam tomorrow, I deeply and completely accept myself. What we're repeating when we tap on here is called the reminder phrase, which is simply the blank part of the setup phrase that we fill in the blank with. So in this example, it's feeling anxious about my exam tomorrow. So the idea is I'm tapping on this spot while I'm repeating this phrase, feeling anxious about my exam tomorrow, feeling anxious about my exam tomorrow. You want to make sure you tap about 8 times on each spot. You repeat the phrase as often as you need to cover that sort of amount of tapping times. Now in doing this, and this is where Western psychology has something to say about this, we're actually conducting a form of what's called exposure therapy. So let's say that the exposure therapy is a form of Western psychotherapy, which is all about dealing with anxieties and phobias, etc. And the idea is that you expose yourself repeatedly to the thing that is generating anxiety or fears or anger, whatever the case may be. So, for example, if you have a spider phobia, you may have seen footage of people that start off with a spider in a glass cage over the other side of the room, and that's going to generate a whole lot of anxiety. They're doing deep breathing, they're calming themselves, they're relaxing, until they can handle seeing the spider in a glass box over the other side of the room. Then the therapist will bring the box a couple of feet closer, and the person gets highly anxious again. It triggers because the spider's getting closer. They do more deep breathing, they calm themselves, they just get more and more comfortable with the spider being a couple of feet closer. Then they bring it closer again. I've seen footage of people where that exposure therapy has been so successful, not only have they allowed this big spider like a huntsman or a tarantula walk on their hand, but they've actually had them on their face, which I couldn't do. But that's how effective exposure therapy can be. So gradually exposing yourself more and more and more to the feared stimuli until the fear around it begins to diminish and you can cope with being in touch with that stimuli. So EFT bears some similarities to Western psychology's exposure therapy. Now keep in mind, let's say if the feared thing is the exam tomorrow or the sandwich that I nearly choked to death on, then the feared stimuli doesn't exist out there sitting in a glass box, but it exists within here in terms of my memory and how I've encoded that experience neurologically. So you can expose yourself to an external stimuli in exposure therapy, or you can expose yourself to an internal stimuli. And in EFT, we're essentially exposing ourselves to an internal feared stimuli. So with the example that we're working with today, the fear of the exam tomorrow, when I start thinking, I start engaging with my fear about the exam tomorrow, I think about it, I indulge in that fear, then I'm re-exposing myself to the fearful stimuli, which is the exam tomorrow. Or if the sandwich that I nearly choked to death on, I'm imagining that sandwich, I'm repeating a verbal phrase about that sandwich, about feeling highly anxious whenever I think of sandwiches, and I'm exposing myself to that fearful stimuli. And in doing that, I'm turning on the amygdala, and I'm ensuring there's electrical activity whizzing around that. Again, with the plasma ball model, I've turned it on with the setup phrase, which is exactly what we want to have happen. We've got to have it turned on for it to be able to move, to go anywhere else. Otherwise, it's just going to be stuck in the amygdala, and it's going to keep on, we're going to keep on being triggered into fearful responses, highly anxious responses, whenever we're exposed to that fearful stimuli. So we turn on the plasma ball, we turn on the amygdala with the setup phrase, and then when we're tapping on the different spots, we're repeating the reminder phrase, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. And what that's doing is it's ensuring that the plasma ball stays on. It ensures the repeated reminder phrase ensures that we're still having all this electrochemical activity going on. Keep in mind the goal is to flatten the battery, so we want to make sure that it stays on, and the reminder phrase is doing exactly that. It's ensuring that the plasma ball stays on, that the electrochemical activity is still highly activated in and around the amygdala. Okay, so the plasma ball stays on, the amygdala stays activated. Tapping on all these different spots. So the first one begins here, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. The next one is on the side of the eye, on the rim of the bony socket, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. The next one is below my eye, again on the rim of the bony socket, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Then to below the nose, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Below on my chin, below my lip, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. At the beginning of my collarbone, so if you can feel the tendons in your neck, where they come down, you'll feel the beginning of the collarbone, and where the collarbone begins there's a bulb of bone, so tapping on that bulb of bone, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. The next spot is under the arm. They say in line with your nipples. They don't say if that's in line with where your nipples are now or where your nipples used to be, but you can work it out for yourself. In line with your nipples. Feeling anxious about my exam tomorrow. The next spot is 1 inch below your nipple. Feeling anxious about my exam tomorrow. Tapping on that spot. Now, if you put your two hands together in a prayer position and you roll your hands like that so the thumbs join, where the thumbs join on that outer part of your thumbnail, that's the next spot. So it's that, what you can see here, it's that corner there on the outside of the thumbnail, tapping on that spot. Feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Same spot on your pointer finger, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Same spot on your middle finger, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Same spot on your little finger or the baby finger, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Then you do the karate chop point again, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Then you go on to what they call the this spot here. I'm just blanking on what they call that. Doesn't matter what it's called. If you feel in between the tendons of your little finger and your ring finger, just back from the knuckle, there's a dent. They call it the Gamut Point. So tapping on that spot, and you're still repeating the reminder phrase, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Now, if this didn't seem weird, this process, it's about to get a whole lot weirder while we're tapping on the Gamut Point, and I'll explain to you why we do what we do, even though it's going to seem weird. Tapping on that, keep your, now closing your eyes, and you're still repeating the phrase, anxious about the exam tomorrow, opening your eyes, anxious about the exam tomorrow, looking hard down to your right, keeping your head still but looking hard down to your right, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Looking hard down to your left, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Rolling your eyes in a bigger circle in one direction as you can, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Rolling your eyes in a bigger circle in the opposite direction, feeling anxious about the exam tomorrow. Hum a tune that you knew before you were 5 years old. If you can think of a nursery rhyme that has no negative associations for you, then hum that. If you can't, then just think of Happy Birthday. Most kids know Happy Birthday before they're 5 years old. So humming. Then count rapidly from 1 to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hum again. Then back to the beginning of the process again. Feeling anxious about exams tomorrow. Feeling anxious about my exam 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 tomorrow. And the process then stops here with tapping on the karate chop point. Stop and take a deep breath. Now it's a good idea to rate your anxiety before you start the process from 0 to 10, so 0 is not at all, 10 is fully anxious, and then rate it again after you've done the process from 0 to 10. You will probably find that the anxiety level has gone down. You may want to do the procedure again in order for it to come down even further to a level that you feel comfortable with. As I said before, when you get the hang of it, the whole thing takes about 1.5 minutes. It seems kind of time consuming now when we're just going through the explanation. But when you get the hang of it, it will only take about 1.5 minutes. Now, let's have a look at what we've done. In tapping on all these different spots, I've provided brain stimulation. So I've got nerve endings that become activated when I'm doing that. And because that's on the left side of my body, the areas on the right side of my brain are becoming activated that are receiving those nerve impulses. And right now my brain is going through, certain parts of my brain is going through a process of saying, well, I'm receiving nerve stimulation. What's going on? What's this about? Is it dangerous? No. Is it sharp? No. Is it hot? No. Is it painful? No. Do I need to worry about it? No, I don't need to worry about it. Every different spot that I do that in, there's a different part of my sensory cortex which is making sense of those nerve impulses. It's going through that decision-making process to make sense of it. So we can depict that here